Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now I'm delighted that my guest today is one of Britain's best known journalists. Toby Young is currently a columnist for The Spectator, but in his career he's done a huge number of things. He founded a magazine called The Modern Review back in the 90s. He wrote for Vanity Fair. He also wrote the best-selling book, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which was then made into a film. Now, since then, he's also become a champion for free schools. He's founded 4 of them. And now he is about to launch a new organisation, which is called the Free Speech Union. Thanks very much for joining us,
Thank you,
Toby. First of all, can you tell us what is the Free Speech Union?
So the Free Speech Union will be a mass membership organisation that stands up for the speech rights of its members. If a member ends up being targeted by an outrage mob on social media because they've dissented from the prevailing orthodoxy or inadvertently used a taboo word or something along those lines, we will defend them on social media. We'll mobilise our members to come to their defence and praise them on social media. If they've been accused of something, we'll pass the evidence. We'll try and make sure that they're put through some kind of due process and not just presumed guilty and immediately cast out in the way Roger Scruton was when George Eaton, I think it was, plucked various things he'd said out of context, put them on social media and immediately whipped up a kind of blood-crazed feeding frenzy, which ended with him losing his job as a government advisor. In addition, if people start circulating petitions or open letters, we'll start counter-petitions. Right. If they start writing letters or emails to the person's employer, we'll start a letter writing or email campaign to urge their employer not to fire them. If they're put through some sort of disciplinary process or if they're fired, we will, I think, in most cases provide them with legal assistance. And if they do go to law, we'll help them crowdfund so they can fight their case. We're in the midst of a really censorious moment, not just here but across the Anglosphere, a kind of new climate of Maoist intolerance in which any dissent from the prevailing orthodoxy, any opinion which falls outside the increasingly narrowing confines of the Overton window, anyone responsible for challenging the prevailing orthodoxy, even if they're on the left. So, we see it with Selina Todd, Professor of Modern History at Oxford, currently has to have a security guard to accompany her from her rooms to the lecture theatre because she has had the temerity to challenge some of the more outlandish claims of the trans-Taliban. So we want to create a more tolerant atmosphere. We want to protect people from being punished, from being singled out in this way by these twitchfork mobs. And I hope that we can give people a bit of courage and also give the mobsters, pause for thought before they come after people like Selina Todd in future.
So would it be right to say that, say, for example, to take a recent example of Alistair Stewart, that's a perfect example, is it not?
Alistair Stewart is a perfect example. Here is a distinguished, much-loved broadcaster, employed by ITV for 40 years. One careless tweet. And even describing it as careless is putting it quite strongly.
Yes, I think.
He quotes Shakespeare, and to make a technical point, in the Shakespearean quote in question, the individual, the quote in Measure for Measure is aimed at, is not being compared to an ape. It's a simile, not a metaphor. Nonetheless, because of this one tweet, which the person, he didn't even include this person in the Twitter exchange, but nonetheless, because he was using this passage from Measure for Measure to describe this individual in some sense, the individual took offence, accused him of being racist, and he was, thrown under a bus. I mean, yes, he resigned, but, ITN left you in no doubt that they had acted to kind of force his resignation. Had he been a member of the Free Speech Union, we would have urged him to sit tight. If he'd been put through some sort of disciplinary process, we would have, I think, tried to make sure a solicitor was with him during those meetings. if they'd gone on to fire him, I'm not sure they would, but if they had done, we would have urged him to sue them for constructive dismissal, and we would have crowdfunded to help him pay his legal costs. So I hope that had he been a member of the Free Speech Union, this wouldn't have happened and he'd still have his job.
The funny thing about things such as with Alistair Stewart, or with many of these things, is that it seems to be a lot of it entirely phony, in the sense that no one seriously thinks Alistair Stewart is a racist. You know, this is what almost the people who are accusing him, I'm sure they don't even believe it either. It just seems to be something which is about maybe virtue signalling, or do you not find?
It is odd that someone like Alistair Stewart, whom, you know, everybody, I think, has a view of. They know him, they trust him. Yeah. He's been reading the news for 40 years. Yeah. For him to be accused of racism on the basis of a single tweet, and it takes quite a lot of kind of interpretive license to deem that tweet racist. And set against that, his 40-year track record, never been accused of anything like that before. And when he resigned, quote unquote, lots of his colleagues, some of them women of colour, testified to the fact that he's not a racist. So the fact that someone can be deemed racist, and the fact that their employer can take that accusation, that really serious allegation, at face value, and not think, well, if someone's made that accusation, let's put them through some sort of due process. Yeah. Let's weigh that one tweet against everything else we know about this person, against his entire career. That would be the fair way to go about it, not just to assume, guilty until proven innocent, and by the way, we're not going to even give you a chance to prove your innocence, we're just going to toss you to the wolves. Yeah. I mean, it really is disgraceful. This sort of thing cannot continue.
But was there something which actually basically made you think to yourself, right, enough is enough? I mean, because we complain about this growing sense of restriction on free speech. Was there something that happened, or was there one particular incident which made you think, actually, I've got to do something?
Well, yes, there was. At the beginning of 2018, I was appointed to the board of the Office for Students, a new higher education regulator, by Theresa May. I was one of 15 non-executive directors. It was an unpaid job. I wasn't Theresa May's new universities czar, which is how it was described. I mean, curiously, over the course of the kind of week in which I was monstered by first social media and then the mainstream media, I was elevated. So originally I started out as one of 15 non-executive directors. Then I became, a key universities advisor, then a government advisor, then a universities czar. I mean, if I'd have held on, I would have become more important than the Prime Minister. Because I think in part because I'm a white, middle-aged, cisgendered, heterosexual, cishet, I think is the term. Right. Brexit-supporting, Tory, middle-aged, balding, outspoken male. The university sector didn't take very kindly to my appointment, didn't like the idea of me being a regulator overseeing their activities. So immediately the offence archaeologists went to work, sifting through everything I'd said or written. Dating back to 1987, Paul Mason dug up a passage from an essay I wrote in a book edited by Rachel Johnson, Boris's sister, in 1987, and the essay was about class at Oxford. And I described grammar school boys in a slightly unflattering way, but it was self-deprecating because I myself was a grammar school boy at Oxford. Of course, he left that out, portrayed me as a knob and a toff, and suddenly I was this ghastly snob and had no place sitting on this as being a university's czar. When the big problem is how to persuade more working class children to go to university, not to keep them out. As if I need telling that. Thank you, Paul. What have you done to help the working class apart from backing Jeremy Corbyn, which inadvertently did help the working class because it meant Labour became completely unelectable. Anyway, putting that to one side, another example, Peter. I wrote a piece for the Spectator in 2001. and in which I praised this obscure satellite channel, now long defunct, called Men and Motors. And there was one particular.
I remember it.
You remember
Granada.
There you are. I think fantastic, fantastic channel. And if you're a bit of a, if you're into cars. Anyway, they had this one program which featured kind of topless girls draping themselves over kind of fast cars, and I praised this show in this piece, and the sub-editor of the Spectator at the time put the headline on it, "Confessions of a Porn Addict," as a sort of gag. And I thought it was quite funny too, until I think it was 17 years later, some little online metal detectorist kind of found this in the Spectator's digital archive, took a screen grab, put the screen grab on Twitter, and then, literally within half an hour, the Evening Standard ran a piece on, I think, page 3 with the headline, "Pressure mounts on Theresa May as new university czar confesses to being porn addict." And it was as though, the kind of Gestapo had me under the hot lights the night before, and I just, reluctantly confessed to being a kind of complete sexual deviant. I mean, it was, and thank you, George Osborne, I thought you were a Tory. Anyway, there was just a deluge of kind of nonsense like this. Some silly things I'd said on Twitter late at night after a couple of glasses of wine were brought up. This was like 10 years ago. And at the end of 7 days, there'd been an urgent question in Parliament in which, various virtue signalling MPs, including some Conservatives, not Conservatives anymore, I'm glad to say, but people like Sarah Wollaston kind of lined up to condemn me. Thanks, John Bercow, for granting that. And then there was a petition, a change.org petition, which had over 220,000 signatures urging Theresa May to sack me. There was a Guardian journalist permanently stationed at the end of my driveway. Would have brought him a cup of tea, Michael Gove style, but I'd run out of almond milk. And in the end, I resigned. Partly to protect the other charities I was involved with. Didn't want the kind of the mob to start turning their attention to them and saying, "What are you doing employing Toby Young?" Charities have to remain squeaky clean for a variety of reasons. They're dependent on government funding and private donations and so forth. So I stepped down from the Office for Students, hoping naively that would draw a line under the whole affair. This was after 1 week of leading the news, but that was naive. That was like throwing a hunk of raw meat to a shoal of piranha fish.
Exactly.
Once they think you've shown some weakness and they can see blood in the water, they go completely nuts. The blood crazed feeding frenzy really gets going. So I then had to step down as from the board of trustees of the charity I'd set up to house the 4 schools I'd co-founded. I had to step down as a Fulbright Commissioner. I had to step down as an honorary fellow of Buckingham, and I had to resign from my full-time job running an education charity which worked with people wanting to set up free schools. So in total, I lost 5 positions as a result of this being targeted by this outrage mob. And so I was, well and truly cancelled, cast out, put beyond the pale, told I had no place any longer in kind of polite society. So I know what it's like. I mean, and it can be, I don't want to sound like a snowflake, but when you experience something like that, it can be really psychologically traumatic.
Well, I was going to ask you, because you're being very, very amusing about it now, but what actually was it like there? If you've got someone at the end of the driveway and you're losing positions, you're losing jobs. From every point of view, surely, sense of injustice, and all of these things.
I'll tell you the thing which really surprised me about it, and this was brought home to me when I spoke to someone else who'd been cancelled, who was a psychologist. One of the nice things, there aren't many, but one of the nice things about being cancelled is you get to meet lots of other people who've been cancelled, because they inevitably contact you, or you meet them. I work for this Australian publication called Quilette. We had this party in Toronto, beginning of 2019, and there were lots of people at that party who themselves had been cancelled, and it was wonderful to meet these, for the most part, kind of really interesting mavericks and dissenters from all different areas of all political views, but who had ended up kind of, inadvertently often kind of triggering some tripwire, and their careers, their lives were in tatters. But anyway, one of the people I met said that the hardest thing he'd found about being cancelled was having to abandon the just world hypothesis. So the just world hypothesis is the belief that we live in a fundamentally just universe, that the laws of karma apply. And if you're basically a decent person and you observe the social contract, then bad things, gross injustices are not going to befall you. And when they do, it's one of the forms, I think, your sense of injustice takes. The reason it feels so acute is because you hadn't realised it, but you had been labouring under this illusion that you lived in a just universe. I mean, this psychologist said, typically a pious Christian whose young child gets cancer, that's a real test of their faith, because they think, I've been an observant Christian all my life. Why is God turning on me in this way? And sometimes they abandon their faith, sometimes they find a way of rationalising what's happened and keeping their faith. But that's a really extreme example. But for someone like me, an atheist, I don't believe in the laws of karma, it was a shock to discover that I did actually think that if I behaved well, if I was a decent human being, if I observed the social contract, that bad things wouldn't happen to me. I mean, horribly naive, but nonetheless, having to abandon this, having to kind of reconcile myself in the most kind of brutal way to the kind of randomness of the universe was pretty tough.
It reminds me rather of that great Woody Allen movie, Crimes and Misdemeanors, where this is the whole crux of it, that he realises, in fact, the universe is not what he thought it was all the way along. But what does that actually do to you, Toby? I mean, has it changed? Do you think you are a different man now as a result of that?
Well, I was able to survive it, I think, for a variety of reasons. And just to say, not everyone does. So there was a department chair at the University of Dartmouth who was written about in the New York Times towards the end of last year. He was caught up in a Me Too case and quite unfairly treated. I mean, he had a group of women, graduate students in his department, had complained about some of the professors in his department. They hadn't accused them of rape or sexual assault, but of behaving in various inappropriate ways. And he had done what was expected of him. He'd referred it to the Title IX committee at Dartmouth, and it was duly investigated by the authorities. So he felt he'd discharged his responsibilities as department chair. But the women then brought a lawsuit a year later against Dartmouth for, tens of millions of dollars. And what part of the lawsuit was that Dartmouth hadn't done enough when they'd first brought it to this man's attention. And in the lawsuit, they then accused these professors of much more serious misdemeanors, crimes like rape and sexual assault, but different to what they'd originally accused them of. Anyway, this man was then found, he found his colleagues turning on him, a hashtag on Twitter, something like sort of "Do Better Dartmouth" started trending. A woman in the supermarket, his local supermarket, told him he should be ashamed of himself and he was a disgusting human being. He had a wife, he had 2 young children. He felt kind of ostracised by his community, and he hadn't done anything wrong. But he was just swept up in the kind of Me Too moral panic. And he'd had some mental health difficulties 20 years earlier. It all came flooding back. He had electroconvulsive therapy to try and treat his depression. That didn't work. He ended up taking his own life towards the end of last year. And he's not the only one. There are I can think of at least half a dozen people who, as a result of being cancelled, of being targeted, particularly on social media, have ended up taking their own lives. Nothing like that, I never came close to anything like that, partly because I have a stable and loving marriage. I'm a reasonably psychologically robust person. I've never had mental health issues. Lots of my friends stood by me. Even, some people defended me in the press. Fraser Nelson, for instance, wrote a really staunch, robust defence of me. Rod Liddell. My Spectator colleagues were. Andrew Neil. They were fantastic. So for all those reasons, I got through it. Am I a different person? Well, I think I'm sort of. I think before it happened, I sort of thought that. I thought probably that there was some merit in trying to remain sort of on the right side of kind of mainstream liberal good opinion. James Dellingpole, who I do a kind of weekly podcast with called London Calling, he would always kind of take the mickey out of me for not being prepared to say the more outlandish, provocative things that he said, because I was sort of scared about falling out with, my mates on The Guardian or whatever it might be. Right. And I realise now that he was probably right, that was a bit cuckish of me, to use his phrase, and that actually, we imagine that that our friends on the liberal left will stick up for us when we are accused of something like what I was accused of, when you're branded a homophobe or a transphobe or a misogynist. People and you've worked with for many years, colleagues on papers like The Guardian will stick up for you, but no, in my case they really didn't. So now I've become kind of, well, I'll just call it as I see it and speak my mind and not worry about the likely PR ramifications, because you're never going to get that stuff right under any circumstances. But it certainly has inspired me to set up the Free Speech Union. I talked about it at the time. I thought, well, if one good thing could come out of this, I can start an organisation that can offer some kind of protection to people who find themselves in the position I find myself in, because you don't know who to turn to for legal advice, for PR advice. You feel really isolated, even if your friends are sticking by you. Most of the time you feel quite isolated. Yes. And so I really wanted to create an organisation that can provide people with all the help, both professionally and personally and psychologically, that they will need if they find themselves, in the eye of a storm like this, when they're being assailed on every side by this kind of by these mobs. I wanted to provide a kind of safe haven for them, and a union seems like the perfect organisation, the perfect kind of entity to provide that kind of protection. Once upon a time, unions used to provide that sort of protection to their members. One of the reasons unions were set up in the 19th century was to enable, workers to challenge the political views of their bosses without risking being fired. Not really anymore. Organisations like Liberty and Amnesty International, PEN, they used to stick up for people, writers anyway, intellectuals, academics who found themselves under fire because they'd said something controversial or because they challenged an orthodoxy or a dogma. Not anymore, not for the most part. Index on censorship is still pretty good, but for the most part, there's no one to turn to if you find yourself in that kind of position.
We just had this case, I think Paul Embry, who was fired, wasn't he, I think it's because he shared a platform with certain other Brexiteers at a Brexit rally, which I think has now been in a battle with his own union, the firefighters union.
It's extraordinary. I mean, the treatment of people who were pro-Brexit during the past 3.5 years by some organisations, treating them as though they were beyond the pale. The position they were advocating was really indistinguishable from racism, xenophobia, calling them Little Englands. I mean, what it's like. You would expect universities, at least, trade unions at least, which supposedly uphold the free speech of people within their organisations. You'd expect them to have been a little more tolerant of some viewpoint diversity, but no.
This is actually going to be one area, surely, at universities, where you're going to have maybe your work cut out, really, because this is where free speech is really being suppressed, isn't it? I mean, you wrote recently in The Critic about an incident where you were speaking at a debate, but there was some poor guy you met afterwards who was virtually,
it was extraordinary,
ostracised for being quite a mainstream, just a mainstream Tory, I guess.
I had a pretty tough time. It was a debate during the general election, and I was sticking up for Boris Johnson, and I was, insulted in the chamber, called a paedophile by the co-president of the Durham Labour Club, called a nonce by the lead speaker on the other side. And this was in a fairly respectable, debating society in one of the oldest universities in England. So I was pretty shocked. And in the bar afterwards, this young man came up and introduced himself and told me his story. He was a small c conservative. In his first year, he'd contributed to this forum that had been created, this online forum for students that were due to come to the university. He was the first person in his family to go to university, incidentally. He was from a Catholic background. And he had expressed his view, his religiously informed view, that he didn't think that Catholic priests should be forced to marry gay couples. He thought that should be their choice. And he challenged the idea that trans women are women and indistinguishable from people who are born as women. He'd said some pro-Israeli things in this forum. Anyway, because he'd effectively outed himself as you say, as having fairly mainstream conservative views. I mean, maybe the view about gay marriage isn't as mainstream as all that, but certainly doesn't make him. It doesn't make him a homophobe, No. And I think he was accused of being in favour of ethnic cleansing because he'd made these sort of mildly supportive comments about the state of Israel. It was extraordinary, and he was targeted by a kind of energetic group of left-wing activists on the Durham campus in his college. Someone slapped him in the face in the bar. Another person threw a plate at him in the dining hall and wrestled him to the ground. The woman, the second or third year student whom Durham had assigned to him as his mother, quote unquote, and her a pastoral role to kind of look after freshers who are a little bit at sea. She encouraged a gay friend of hers to make a pass at him in some sort of cack-handed attempt to expose his bigotry. It was all horrible, all ghastly.
Isn't it?
It's a kind of soft and not so soft totalitarianism. The intolerance for people with conservative views. And I said, and the strange thing is that at Durham, about 20% of the student body is conservative. In most universities, it's about 10%. So if anything, what happened to him was unusually mild compared to the treatment that other out conservatives get at universities. I don't know if you saw that policy exchange report
I did indeed.
Last year. Yeah. And it revealed that 60% of students who are pro-Brexit were uncomfortable airing their pro-Brexit views in front of their classmates for fear of the repercussions. And quite rightly, I think we now realise.
Didn't it also reveal something which is a bit of a wider concern, which is that there now are people, there's a significant group of people who actually don't believe in free speech. I mean, they sort of feel it's something that should come second or third in the priorities.
Yeah, it's. I think one of the reasons that free speech is under assault in universities is because the regressive left, the intersectional social justice left, has succeeded, I think, in embedding this narrative that there is a fundamental conflict between the rights of minorities, of marginalised groups, of women, and the right to free speech. That the two are in conflict. And if you side with free speech, you're siding against those historically victimised groups. It's complete nonsense. Those historically victimised groups have been, one of the main beneficiaries of free speech over the years. The civil rights movement couldn't have taken place if America didn't have the First Amendment. We wouldn't have rights for women if people hadn't stood up for free speech for women when the suffragettes were clamouring for universal suffrage. The idea that there is this conflict and that free speech isn't for everyone. It's just an opportunity. It's just really an excuse for male, pale and stale conservatives to kind of flex their muscles and shout down their opponents. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. And I think to really, one of the things I hope the Free Speech Union can do is to challenge this idea that there is a conflict between, viewpoint diversity on the one hand and all these other kinds of diversity on the other. If we want to live in a more open, humane, compassionate society, the way to get there is not to suppress free speech. It's to defend everyone's right to free speech.
These things, these are pretty serious sort of issues, Toby. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you've sort of moved, it seems to me, in terms of your preoccupations. You've moved from, you were basically working at, say, Vanity Fair. Your book was a sort of a self-mocking account of that. And but you've become basically more political, have you not? I mean, when did that sort of happen? Or were you always bubbling under the surface political?
Well, I think I was always small c conservative. I mean, I'd gone through periods of
Your father was a very famous Labour man.
My father was a lifelong socialist, even though at one stage he left the Labour Party and joined the SDP. They went back to the Labour Party. And my mother was fairly left-wing too. And people often sort of bring that up as if it's odd that if you have left-wing parents but you yourself are a conservative, people think that's a bit suspect. You must be engaged in some sort of Oedipal drama in which you're constantly battling against your father. This is one of the kind of memes that was used when I was mobbed at the beginning of 2018. He's obsessed with his dad. He's got this kind of huge psychological issue. He's constantly tilting against the kind of imposing figure of his father, and that's how to explain his politics. And people say sometimes the same things about Hilary Benn, who isn't quite as left-wing as Tony Benn, so he must therefore be engaged in some sort of Oedipal drama. Yeah. I mean, people don't say the same about if you have right-wing parents and you're a left-winger, then you're enlightened. Then you've emerged from the darkness, the bigotry of the kind of the fog you were enveloped in as a child in this horribly closed household. You've emerged into the light and become a kind of psychologically healthy person. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. Anyway, you're right. I've certainly become kind of more political over the course of my career. I mean, I guess I used to write much more about culture in a non-political way. Yeah. And then I started writing, when I got involved in the free schools movement, I started writing more about politics. And now the border between culture and politics has become much more porous. I mean, we are engaged in, and have been engaged in for some time now, a culture war. And that means that I can write about both politics and culture in a way that comes quite naturally, having written about both for sort of 35 years.
But there is a sort of a sense as well that these are really compelling things, aren't they? These cultural issues, they are really compelling issues. And so almost one can't ignore them. What's interesting is I mentioned the Modern Review in the introduction, which I remember reading. I loved it. I should explain to people that this was it was like a paper actually, wasn't it? It was a magazine.
Yeah.
But the whole point was that you were actually writing about, as it were, the popular arts, but in a highbrow way. I think that was the point. But that was hugely influential, wasn't it? That's the way the Sunday Times covers them now, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Andrew Neil once confessed to me that he'd based The Culture, the Sunday Times arts and culture section, on the Modern Review.
Yes.
It was a magazine that Julie Burchell and Cosmo Landesman and I set up in 1991 in my sort of bedsit in Shepherd's Bush. I think I had Jan Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone. He created the first issue of Rolling Stone on his kitchen table, and I had fantasies of becoming this kind of multi-millionaire magazine publisher flying around in private jets. But actually, we never graduated out of my kitchen in my bedsit in Shepherd's Bush. It was there for 4 years. It was born there and it died there. But it was a great experience. As you say, it was, I think the motto was low culture for highbrows. And we employed kind of intellectuals and academics and kind of smart journalists to write long, scholarly pieces about things like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Madonna. And many the magazine was, at that time, now we think, what's radical about that? But back then, that was quite a radical approach. Most people employed kind of slightly snotty critics to write about pop culture, to review airport novels, and did it in this kind of disdainful, kind of snobbish way. And so we wanted to turn the tables on them and actually celebrate what we really loved about popular culture, but not in a kind of slumming it way as a sort of reaction to high culture, but just saying actually some of this stuff is so good it deserves to be put alongside some of the best stuff in high culture. And so that was the kind of motif. But very quickly, I think the broadsheets, particularly the Sunday Times, recognised that this was the kind of direction of travel. And they immediately started changing the way they covered mass culture and poached quite a few of our writers. So Tom Schoen, who was the literary editor of the Modern Review, was poached by The Culture to become the Sunday Times film critic. Not that I minded; it was great to kind of be.
He's still there. He's back there now, isn't he? I think
he's back. He's back. Actually, he's now doing that again. Yeah, he's actually a great critic.
I don't know. Therefore, if you were writing about culture at that point, and obviously have done since, I wondered, Toby, with Brexit, has your own cultural life? This is something I've been thinking about a lot. Has your own cultural life altered and changed in any way? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, you wrote for Vanity Fair, didn't you? I used to read Vanity Fair. I enjoyed it. Now I can't really take it anymore because it seems to be just one long Trump bashing thing, and also, and I wonder, is what you read and what you watch and listen to, has that been altered by Brexit? Have you found that sort of like I can't watch the actor anymore, or I can't do, I can't read, I know what I'm going to get?
I'd say I haven't been that I'm not so wrapped up in the Brexit drama that it's completely poisoned me against the kind of ultra Remainers when I see them pop up on TV or on the stage and so forth. So, I can still enjoy, Hugh Grant in Four Weddings and a Funeral, even though, he tried to muzzle the press in Hacked Off, and he campaigned for, I think, Chuka Umunna and various, I think all the candidates he campaigned for in December all lost, as we know. But I think I can kind of separate, I think, the man, his performances from his kind of public persona. I think it's, you're right about, it's extraordinary the extent to which so many fairly mainstream, liberal with a small L, magazines and newspapers that used to have lots of readable stuff in them back in the day, back in the not too distant day, 10, 15 years ago. Magazines like Vanity Fair, employed some really good writers, not the least of which was Christopher Hitchens, who supported, who used his column in part as a platform to make the case for the Iraq War, and was, anti-woke before his time. But now you don't see that diversity, that range of views in publications like Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, maybe slightly less guilty of this, but pretty much going in the same direction. It's as though they've all been captured by the woke left. It's like the left took this kind of regressive turn. I mean, not everyone on the left kind of went along for the ride, but they've become the kind of dominant voice, and they've cowed the kind of much more reasonable, progressive members of the left. They've cowed them, and and some of them are kind of being forced over to our side. Someone like Andrew Doyle, for instance, the creator of Titania McGrath. I mean, describes himself as a socialist, but is almost kind of he's so unwelcome in the woke church, and he's effectively an apostate. And of course, we know the left hates apostates even more than heretics. So he's kind of been forced to kind of join people like you and I in our kind of along with the other deplorables. But I hope one of the things that the Free Speech Union can achieve is to provide some protection to the more reasonable members of the left from being turned on and ostracised by their woke colleagues. What we see with the way in which gender-critical feminists are being treated. I mean, the extraordinary thing about that is that the trans Taliban, who make life so difficult for gender-critical feminists like Kathleen Stock, Professor of Philosophy at Sussex University, is on the advisory council of the Free Speech Union. Receives death threats, has things thrown at her. People set off fire alarms when she tries to speak, so she can't be heard. She's a member, a long-standing member of the left, in the trans Taliban are allowed to get away with it because the kind of the Politburo within the kind of the woke Kremlin have kind of decreed that if you need to be a good ally of these kind of trans militant advocates, and if you criticise them, if you dissent from their orthodoxy, even in the smallest way, then you're an enemy. And it's we have to try and reduce the power of that Politburo and create more space in our society for people to discuss issues like whether you should be able to self-identify more easily if you think you're transgendered. I mean, that's a really critical issue that affects lots of people. Should we have gender-neutral toilets? Should trans women be allowed into women's changing rooms or women's refuges? Or should they be allowed to transfer from men's prisons to women's prisons? It's all happened because of it's as though we haven't had a chance to have a public conversation about it because everybody's too scared to say what they really think.
It seems to me that the trans issue is sort of maybe a bridge too far. Maybe this is where things are turning. I remember we had Rod Little on he said this. He thought this was going to be, he had a wonderful phrase, he called it peak wank. Basically, this was going to be the ridiculousness of this issue was actually going to be the turning point.
Well, interesting you say that, Peter. I mean, I would love to think that we had reached, peak wank. But every time you think we have, it then gets worse.
They double down.
I thought, people thought Ricky Gervais, he gets away with his opening monologue at the Golden Globes, which was a kind of fantastic, kind of exhilarating, kind of full-throated assault on the kind of censorious high priests of the woke church. Marvellous stuff. You think everyone thought this is a turning point. He's been able to, he's attacked them and he hasn't been cancelled. He's still with us. He'll probably be doing the opening monologue next year if the Hollywood Foreign Press Association give him enough money. But then 2 weeks later, Alistair Stewart tossed to the wolves for one careless tweet. You think that the tide has turned, and then it just starts coming in again. So I think we really need more organisations. I hope the Free Speech Union isn't the only one, but I hope it's a start. More organisations like this that can stand up for dissenters, for nonconformists, for mavericks, so they can speak out without risking their livelihoods, say what they think, challenge some of the prevailing orthodoxies which need to be challenged, engage in conversations about important issues that affect so many people without feeling they have to censor what they really think.
I think obviously it's a fantastic initiative and one that is utterly vital. I mean, I know we're ending now, but I know that this week you highlighted a situation in Canada where the government's talking about you have to have a license for the internet to do shows like this even, or podcasts. I think you tweeted about it. That might not seem like what you're talking about, but it is an area of free speech. These are the areas we're going to have to look at, aren't they?
The danger of what's happening in Canada and of the regulations that our government is proposing to create, and which they outlined in the Online Harms White Paper, which proposed, creating a new internet regulator. It's the same problem we faced with the Hacked Off, wanting to create a state-approved regulator of the press. The problem is that the people who want to become regulators are inevitably the kind of purse-lipped, finger-wagging, left-wing scolds, the Puritans, the sort of people that George Orwell described as the boiled rabbits of the left. They're the people who will essentially decide what people can and can't read, what they can and can't see on Twitter, on Facebook, what they can see on YouTube. It'll be a further narrowing of the Overton window, so everyone should oppose any attempt to try and replicate what's happening in Canada over here. And I hope that the Free Speech Union can lend its weight to the campaign against the creation of internet regulation, greater internet regulation in this country. I should just say, Peter, I hope by the time this is broadcast that the Free Speech Union's website is live. We're kind of frantically trying to get it ready. It'll be at freespeechunion.org. And if you're interested in joining, hopefully go to the website. It'll tell you how to do that. But if it's not, if for some reason we're still, it's still in beta and we're still road testing it, then just email me at info@freespeechunion.org, info@freespeechunion.org, and I can process your membership application and make sure you get your card and everything else, in a couple of weeks.
So that goes for everyone who's watching who wants to do that, wants to join?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Great.
Anyone can join.
And also, will you be having any form of events, Toby? I mean,
yes,
something like that.
I think one of the really important things that we hope to do is to create public spaces where people can have difficult conversations, speakeasies in bars, public debates in institutions like the Emmanuel Centre, Conway Hall, debates at universities in conjunction with free speech societies at universities, where people with passionately opposing views can model how to have courteous, good-humoured, well-mannered conversations, and to show people that it's possible to disagree but to remain on civil terms, and that merely challenging the prevailing orthodoxy doesn't actually risk anyone's safety. It's not a form of violence. It's not going to send people into a spiral of psychological trauma. Actually, it's just a conversation.
Yeah. And this has been a great one. So thank you very much indeed, Toby. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for watching So What You're Saying Is. So we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye.